Lena had never been the center of attention. She preferred blending in, keeping to the sidelines, her quiet nature always a stark contrast to the world around her. A soft-spoken girl in a noisy world, she was comfortable in her own bubble of solitude, often finding comfort in the pages of books and the soft rustling of the trees during her evening walks. Yet today, something felt different. As she sat on the park bench, clutching her bag tightly in her lap, her heart raced. She knew they were watching her. A gang of bikers had slowly circled around her, their loud engines causing the air to tremble. She tried to ignore them, keeping her eyes fixed on the path ahead, her hands slightly shaking as she gripped her purse even harder. The sound of their motorcycles revving grew louder, and she could feel the heat of their stares piercing through her. They were leaning against the fence, eyes fixed on her, making no attempt to hide their intentions. Lena had heard stories of girls who had been harassed, humiliated in parks like this. She had hoped, prayed even, that it would never happen to her. But now, with the bikers lingering too long and their lacquer cutting through the air, she knew it was inevitable. "Hey, girl!" One of them, a burly man with tattoos covering his arms, called out to her. His voice was rough, as if he was used to commanding attention. She flinched, her heart pounding louder in her ears. "You lost or something? Or are you just sitting here waiting for someone?" Lena didn't answer. She didn't know what to say. Every instinct in her screamed to leave, to run, but she couldn't. She was frozen, trapped by their presence and her own fear. She looked down, hoping they'd just leave, hoping they would forget about her. The laughter only grew, and then the man took a step forward, his boots thudding on the ground. "I said, are you waiting for someone?" he repeated, stepping closer, the smell of cigarette smoke and engine oil heavy on his breath. Lena's face flushed. She wanted to say something, to tell him to leave her alone, but the words were stuck. Her eyes were cast down, and she bit her lip nervously. But just as she opened her mouth to speak, another voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Lena's head snapped up, her breath catching in her throat. Standing just a few feet away, a man with short-cropped hair and a steely gaze was staring down the bikers, his arms crossed over his chest. The moment he spoke, the atmosphere shifted. The bikers froze for a split second, unsure of who had spoken, their arrogance wavered. "Move along," the man said, his voice low but commanding. There was no mistaking the authority in his tone. "You're making her uncomfortable. Leave her alone." Lena's eyes widened. Her heart pounded as she recognized the man. Jason Statham. She had heard his name so many times over the years, his fame making him a household name. But she had never expected him to be the one to step in. The bikers eyed him warily, sizing him up. The leader, the one who had spoken to Lena, seemed to hesitate, a momentary flicker of doubt in his eyes. "You know who I am, mate," he sneered. "This is our turf. Stay out of it." Jason didn't move, his gaze unyielding. "I don't care about your turf," he said, his voice steady, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "What I care about is you leaving her the hell alone." Lena watched in awe as Jason stood tall, unmoved by the threats of the bikers. The leader tried to step closer, but Jason held his ground, not flinching an inch. The bikers could sense something in him, something they hadn't expected. Jason wasn't afraid. The tension hung thick in the air, and for a moment, Lena felt herself held in suspended animation. It was as though time had stopped, the world narrowing to just the three of them. And then, the bikers slowly started to back off. The leader spat on the ground, glaring at Jason, but didn't say another word. The others followed suit, mounting their bikes and revving their engines, but they didn't approach again. They seemed to recognize the futility of pressing on. Without a word, they left, the rumble of their bikes fading into the distance. Jason turned back to Lena, his expression softening, though the steel in his gaze never fully disappeared. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentler now, as if the storm had passed. Lena nodded, though her heart was still racing. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding her breath until the bikers were gone. "Thank you," she whispered, barely able to keep her voice steady. Jason gave a small nod. "It's nothing," he said, his tone casual. Just making sure no one takes advantage of a good person. Stays safe. As he walked away, Lena couldn't help but stare after him, her mind still spinning. Jason Statham. Her uncle. She had no idea he would be the one to come to her rescue today. The days that followed that incident were a blur for Lena. She couldn't get the image of those bikers out of her mind, their sneering faces, the threatening way they'd circled around her. Her heart would race every time she thought about it, and when she walked through the park now, her eyes would dart nervously from side to side, as though expecting the gang to appear at any moment. But what scared her most was not just the bikers. It was the overwhelming feeling of helplessness. She had always prided herself on being able to keep a low profile, stay under the radar, avoid drama. But that day, she had been thrust into something she wasn't ready for. She spent most of her days in her small apartment, only leaving for work and the occasional trip to the grocery store. Every time she walked down the street, she felt like the world was watching her, like she had a target on her back. Her thoughts would often drift to that moment when Jason had stepped in, his calm demeanor cutting through the tension. Jason Statham. The name seemed surreal now. Her uncle. The one person who had swooped in like some kind of superhero, without a second thought. At first, she tried to shake it off. She told herself that he had simply been there at the right time, then he didn't know how much he had affected her, how much she had needed him in that moment. But as the days passed, it became clear that the incident hadn't just left an impression on her, it had changed something inside her. It wasn't just the biker she feared now, it was the fact that she had done nothing to defend herself. She had been so frozen, so caught up in the chaos, that she hadn't even thought to speak up or push back. She had stood there, paralyzed, while someone else fought her battle for her. That evening, Lena was at her favorite cafe, sipping her latte, trying to force her mind to relax. She'd never been one to stay in, preferring the quiet hum of the coffee shop to the solitude of her apartment. But that day, her mind was a whirlwind, the events of the past week playing on an endless loop in her head. It wasn't until she felt the familiar weight of someone standing next to her that she realized she wasn't alone. Jason slid into the seat across from her, his sharp eyes scanning the room before settling on her face. Lena's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen him since the park, and though she appreciated his help, she wasn't sure how to act around him now. It was like everything had changed in an instant. "Hey," he said simply, his voice low and casual, but there was an intensity in his gaze that caught her off guard. He wasn't just here to catch up. There was something else, something unspoken in the air between them. Lena gave him a small smile, trying to mask the nerves that had suddenly shot through her. "Hi, Jason. What's up?" Jason didn't immediately respond. Instead, he studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to read something beneath her calm exterior. "I've been thinking about what happened," he finally said, his voice a little softer now. "Are you all right?" Lena opened her mouth to say something, but the words got caught in her throat. How could she explain? How could she admit that she was still terrified of leaving her apartment, still feeling the weight of her own inaction? Jason was waiting for an answer, his stare unwavering. She started, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't know. I guess I'm okay. But I can't stop thinking about it. About them. About what happened." Jason nodded slowly, as though he had expected this. "Yeah, I figured." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "That sort of thing doesn't just go away. You're strong, Lena, but you don't have to handle this alone. Not anymore." Lena's eyes widened slightly, unsure of what to make of his words. "What do you mean?" Jason looked at her for a long moment, his face hardening as he leaned forward slightly. "What happened wasn't just some random encounter. Those bikers were trouble, and they're not going to just forget about you." He paused. "But if you want, I'll make sure they never come near you again." Lena was taken aback by his bluntness, by the fierce determination in his voice. But even more than that, she was struck by the way he said, "If you want," as if, in that moment, the choice was hers. She had never felt so powerless, yet somehow Jason was giving her the power to take control. To choose how the story would go from here. I don't know what to say, she stammered, the weight of his words sinking in. I'm not like you. I can't just. Jason cut her off, his expression softening. You don't have to be like me. You don't have to fight back in the way I do, but you deserve to feel safe. You deserve to stand tall, Lena. And I'm going to help you with that. The sincerity in his words hit her like a wave, and for the first time since that day, she felt something shift inside her. Maybe it wasn't too late to take charge of her own story. Maybe she didn't have to stay in the shadows forever. The following days felt like they stretched on endlessly for Lena. She tried to stick to her routine: work, coffee shop visits, quiet evenings at home. But no matter how hard she tried, her thoughts kept returning to the incident in the park. She couldn't shake the image of the bikers, and how easily they cornered her. It haunted her, kept her up at night, and made even the most mundane tasks feel impossible. But the most unsettling part was the nagging feeling that something had changed within her. The terror she felt that day, her inability to stand up for herself, lingered like a shadow. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a sense of powerlessness, a deep internal struggle that she couldn't quite explain. She had always prided herself on being independent, on not needing anyone to step in for her. But the reality of the situation had shattered that image. And then, one evening, as she walked through the park again, she felt it, the familiar rumble of engines in the distance. Her heart rate spiked, and before she could even think, she froze. The sound grew louder, closer, and panic surged within her. She looked around wildly, but there was no one in sight. She was alone. Just as she was about to turn and leave, a familiar voice called out to her from behind. You all right? Lena turned to see Jason walking toward her. His presence was like a calming force, and for the first time since that day, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. He didn't look at her with pity or concern. He just looked, steady, like he always did. His confidence was like a shield, and for a moment, Lena felt protected by it. I I don't know, she admitted, her voice shaky. I'm still scared, Jason. I keep thinking about them. About what could have happened if you hadn't been there. Jason's expression softened, but he didn't rush to reassure her with empty words. Instead, he stopped in front of her, taking a breath before speaking again. You know, he said, his voice calm, yet there was a subtle intensity to it. Those guys won't be back. I'm making sure of that. Lena glanced up at him, unsure if she was hearing him right. What do you mean? Jason leaned in a little, his eyes narrowing as he looked past her, scanning the surroundings. I know what they're like, he said, his voice low. And I know how to handle people like them. You won't have to deal with them again. I'm not letting anyone intimidate you. Lena's heart swelled with gratitude, but there was something more, something that made her feel not just relieved, but empowered. Jason wasn't just offering protection. He was giving her the assurance that she didn't have to be afraid. And that made all the difference. Thank you, she whispered, unsure of how to express what she was feeling. She wanted to say more, to say that she didn't need someone else to fight her battles, but a part of her realized that this wasn't just about pride, it was about safety. And Jason was offering her that. Jason nodded, his expression thoughtful. You're stronger than you think, Lena, he said quietly. But no one should have to face that kind of fear alone. I'll make sure you're safe. Trust me. Lena took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could start to take control again. Lena hadn't realized just how much the park incident had affected her until she stood there, once again facing the same space, but this time not with the same sense of dread. It had been a week since Jason had promised to take care of things. The words he had spoken to her echoed in her mind as she stared across the park, noticing the familiar benches, the winding paths, and the trees swaying in the breeze. It was hard to believe that just days ago, she had been frozen in fear in that very spot, her heart racing with every passing second as she waited for something to happen. Now, the park felt different. The air was still peaceful, but there was an undercurrent of tension that she hadn't noticed before. Lena knew that Jason had kept his promise, but the effects of what he had done were still sinking in. She could feel the weight of his words, his confidence in her, still carrying her forward. For the first time in days, she felt like she was standing on her own 2 feet. She wasn't alone for long. As she walked towards the familiar bench near the pond, she spotted someone in the distance. Her pulse quickened when she saw the unmistakable leather jackets and motorcycles parked along the edge of the park. The bikers. Her stomach tightened, and for a moment, the fear crept back in. She stood there, frozen once again, unsure of what to do. But then, the voice of reason cut through her panic. It was Jason. He had appeared out of nowhere, just like last time, his presence immediately commanding the space around him. He walked calmly toward her, a reassuring figure who, despite the danger that lingered in the air, made her feel like everything would be okay. "They're not bothering you, are they?" Jason's voice was low, but it carried a weight of authority. His sharp gaze scanned the group of bikers, who were now eyeing him with a mix of curiosity and defiance. They hadn't expected him to show up again, and their hesitation was palpable. Lena shook her head, trying to steady her breath. I don't know," she whispered. "I saw them, and I just froze again. I thought maybe they'd leave me alone." Jason nodded. "You've got nothing to fear. Not with me around," he said firmly, the quiet confidence in his voice taking the edge off her anxiety. "They'll know that if they mess with you, they'll have to deal with me." The bikers had noticed him by now, and one of them, a tall man with a patch on his jacket, smirked as he stepped forward. "What's this? Another hero?" His voice was laced with mockery, but there was a hint of uncertainty there too, as if he wasn't sure how far he could push it. Jason didn't flinch. His eyes never wavered from the man's. "You're messing with the wrong person," he said coolly. "I've been dealing with people like you my whole life. You don't scare me, and you sure as hell don't scare her." The man's smirk faltered, and he glanced around at the other bikers. They were beginning to feel the tension rise, and the challenge in Jason's voice was unmistakable. This wasn't the usual bystander. This was someone who had seen things, someone who had the confidence to stand his ground. "Listen, mate," the biker said, raising his hands in a mock gesture of surrender. "We're just hanging out, all right. No harm done." But his tone lacked the arrogance it had before. Jason took a step closer, his posture unwavering. "No one's going to mess with her. Not now, not ever." There was a brief, tense silence, and then, the bikers slowly started to retreat. They could see that Jason wasn't someone to trifle with, and despite their initial bravado, they weren't willing to push things any further. One by one, they mounted their motorcycles, revved the engines, and drove off without another word. The threat had been neutralized. Lena stood there, her body still tight with residual fear, but as she watched the bikers disappear, a sense of relief washed over her. Jason's presence had done more than just protect her. It had helped her reclaim her power. For the first time in a long while, Lena felt like she wasn't alone in the fight. She had someone who believed in her strength, someone who would stand with her no matter what. "You good?" Jason asked, his voice soft now, no longer carrying the weight of authority, but a kind of concern. Lena nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah. Thanks, Jason. I didn't know I needed that." Jason gave a small smile, the intensity in his eyes softening. "You don't need to be afraid. You got this." Lena took a deep breath, the weight lifting off her shoulders. Maybe she wasn't quite there yet, but with Jason by her side, she could face whatever came next. Lena hadn't been back to the park since the day Jason stepped in to protect her. It wasn't because she didn't want to go. It was just that the place, once a peaceful retreat, now held a different kind of significance. Every time she thought about it, the memory of the bikers, the tension in the air, would flood back into her mind. But that evening, something inside her shifted. She knew it was time. Time to face it, not with fear, but with the confidence that had been slowly building within her since that day. She wasn't the same person who had frozen in terror weeks ago. She walked to the park, taking her time as the golden hues of the setting sun lit the path ahead. The world around her felt different now. The sounds of birds, the rustling leaves, the distant laughter of children, all of it seemed to speak of something she had forgotten for so long: peace. For the first time in what felt like ages, She felt at ease. As she neared the familiar bench by the pond, she spotted a few people scattered around the park, but there was no sign of the bikers. It was almost as if they had vanished. She sat on the bench, the cool evening breeze making the trees sway gently above her. Lena closed her eyes, taking in the moment. She hadn't realized how much she had missed this peace, how much she had longed for it. The sound of footsteps broke her reverie, and she opened her eyes to see Jason walking toward her. His familiar presence, that steady, calm confidence, was the perfect counterbalance to the storm that had once swirled in her mind. It was strange, she thought, how much she had come to rely on him in such a short time. He had given her something she didn't even know she needed, a sense of security, of safety that wasn't defined by fear. "You back here again?" Jason's voice brought her out of her thoughts. He had a small smile on his face, but there was a softness in his eyes as he looked at her, an unspoken understanding between them. Lena nodded, her lips curving into a smile. "Yeah, I figured it was time to come back." Jason sat down next to her, his posture relaxed. "Good. I was starting to think you let them win." Lena chuckled softly, though she could feel the tension lifting from her shoulders. "I guess I almost did," she admitted. "But it's not just about them anymore. I can't let the past control me." Jason's eyes softened, and he turned to look at her more intently. "You're stronger than you think, Lena. You don't need me to protect you all the time." Lena shook her head, a mixture of gratitude and hesitation crossing her face. "It's not that I don't want to stand up for myself. It's just that I didn't know I could. I didn't know how." Jason's voice was gentle, but firm. "You've always had that strength. You just had to find it. I'm not going anywhere, but I think you're ready to handle things on your own now." Lena felt a small wave lift from her chest. She was still nervous, still unsure of herself at times, but there was a fire inside her now, a spark that she hadn't seen in herself before. She had learned something valuable. Sometimes, strength wasn't just about fighting back. It was about standing firm in who you were, facing your fears, and knowing that you didn't have to fight alone. "You're right," she said, her voice steady now. "I'm ready." Jason gave her a smile that was both proud and knowing. "I thought so." For the first time in a long time, Lena felt like she could finally move forward. The park was no longer a place of fear, but a place of strength. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the paths, and as they sat there in silence, Lena realized that the most important battle wasn't won with fists or fear. It was won with a decision to keep moving forward, no matter what. The days that followed felt like a quiet victory for Lena, but the weight of what had happened wasn't something that would fade easily. She walked through life with a newfound sense of confidence, but there was always a lingering thought in the back of her mind. The bikers might be gone, but the fear of being powerless, of being trapped again, was something she couldn't simply shake off. It wasn't just the bikers. It was the realization of how much she had been holding herself back, how much she had let fear shape her life without even knowing it. But now, she wasn't the same. She had stood up for herself once, and now, she knew that she could do it again if the situation ever arose. It was a Thursday when Lena decided it was time to do something more than just walk through life. She had been thinking about it for days, the words Jason had said to her echoing in her mind. "You're stronger than you think." He had been right, and it was time she believed it for herself. The decision was simple. She was going to join a self-defense class. It wasn't just about learning how to protect herself physically. It was about reclaiming control over her life, over her fears. Jason had given her the confidence to take that first step, but now it was time for her to own it. When she walked into the self-defense studio, the instructor, a woman with short dark hair and a no-nonsense attitude, gave her a warm smile. "You're here to learn how to fight back, huh?" she asked, her tone friendly but firm. Lena nodded, feeling a bit nervous but determined. "Yeah, I need to learn how to stand up for myself." The instructor's eyes softened, but there was no mistaking the seriousness of her words. "Good. We're not just teaching you how to throw punches here. We're teaching you how to take control, how to use your own power. It's about mindset first. Once you get that, the rest will follow." Lena felt a spark of something inside her, something familiar, but also new. This was different from anything she had ever done. It wasn't just about strength. It was about finding her own voice again, finding the courage to use it. The class started with basic techniques, but as the minutes ticked by, Lena felt her confidence grow. Each time she practiced a move, she felt stronger, more capable. The self-doubt that had plagued her for so long slowly started to melt away. She wasn't just learning how to defend herself from physical threats. She was learning how to defend her own sense of self-worth. By the end of the class, she was exhausted but energized. The fear that had once held her back seemed like a distant memory now, and she realized something important. She had taken the first real step in her journey to reclaiming her life. It was a small victory, but it was hers. When the class ended, the instructor came over to her, giving her a nod of approval. "You did great. Keep it up." Lena smiled, feeling proud of herself in a way she hadn't in a long time. As she left the studio, she knew this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges, more hurdles, but she was no longer afraid of facing them. With each step, she was proving to herself that she didn't need anyone else to fight her battles. She had the strength to do it herself.